Arcade racers are some of my absolute favourite games to play, and back in the 90s Sega were the undisputed kings of the arcade racer. Yeah, Namco were looking pretty hot with games like Ridge Racer, and Midway were up there too with their successful cruising series, but nobody was coming close to Sega's racing output in the 90s. Daytona USA, Sega Rally, and even motorcycle games like Manx TT, all of them were classics in their own right. Some of my fondest childhood memories involve playing these games in the local arcades. All these games eventually received home ports to Sega's troubled Saturn system, so in the 90s the dream of having the arcade experience at home was getting closer and closer to becoming a reality every day. Unfortunately, one of Sega's best arcade racers never saw the light of day outside of the arcade, and has subsequently gone on to be almost forgotten by the wider gaming community. Enter Motor Raid, a sci-fi racer developed by Sega AM R&D1 and released in 1997 for their Sega Model 2 hardware. It features futuristic motorcycle racing and something that's quite rare in the arcade racing scene, close quarters vehicle combat. Now, I know what you're thinking, this gameplay looks kinda familiar. Motor Raid is basically a cross between the popular Road Rash series, a game infamous for its close quarters combat, and the sci-fi motorbike game Extreme G, released on the Nintendo 64 if anybody happens to remember that game. But beyond that comparison, this game is 100% pure Sega arcade racing bliss. The game was originally sold to arcades as a conversion kit for Manx TT twin cabinets, which were released 2 years earlier in 1995. The game also was released as a standalone DX cabinet which featured solo play, but featured a larger screen for gameplay. As with most motorcycle arcade games, acceleration is performed by twisting the right handle. You steer by leaning the bike's body left or right, and braking is accomplished by squeezing the lever above the accelerator handle. Now, actions that are unique to Motor Raid include a boost that can be activated by twisting the acceleration handle twice. You can see a boost gauge that charges to 3 different levels, one for a short boost, one for a medium boost, and one for an extremely powerful orange boost that also causes you to take out enemies unfortunate enough to come into contact with you along the way. This bar fills up automatically during the race, so you don't have to worry about performing any fancy driving skills mid-race to earn up your boost. On the bike's left handle you have access to the 2 basic attack buttons. Your primary attack is a punch that allows you to punch opponents in close range or to attack using one of the many weapons in the game. The second button allows you to perform a kick. Now this attack is quicker and is good for hitting riders coming in from behind, but generally it does less damage than other attacks, so it isn't something I use too often while playing. If you hold down the punch button while holding a weapon, you can lock onto an opponent in the distance and throw your weapon at them for a ranged attack. This causes you to lose your current weapon but counts as a guaranteed hit against your target. And if the opponent you happen to hit is holding a weapon, you also steal their weapon as a little reward. Now each character also has access to a unique special attack, which is activated by holding down the punch button while your rider is without a weapon. Now these attacks can be quite strong, but honestly it's advisable to be holding a weapon at all times, so this isn't really an attack you should find yourself using too often. Now it's also worth mentioning that if you're without a weapon and you punch an opposing rider, you will steal their weapon, so there's plenty of opportunities mid-race to get your character re-equipped if you're empty-handed. Now the game gives you a selection of 4 different riders: Robin, Io, Guns, and Gila. Each character tends to have strengths in one of 4 different attributes: attack, acceleration, grip, and speed. They also each start the race with a character specific weapon, so there's a fair bit of choice here to suit different racing and combat styles. The game has 2 different modes of play: your standard championship mode, which features a series of races across different tracks, with the goal being to outlast the timer and place as high as possible while doing it, and a time trial mode, which challenges you to a number of laps across a single track of your choice to try and set the quickest time possible, all while still racing against the timer. The game features a grand total of 6 tracks, which is actually a pretty high number for a Sega arcade racer back in the day. Yendras, the beginner track set on a desert planet. Ido, a mountainous planet with strange alien life featured across the track. Reef 8, a tropical planet with underwater sections. Junos, the token ice planet of the game. Bowl, a volcanic planet with sharp twists and turns. And finally Segal, the toughest track in the game. Taking place in a futuristic city at night, this track is only playable by coming first in every race during the championship mode or by entering a cheat code during the track select menu while in time trial mode. This is probably my favourite track in the game since it features a gigantic Sonic the Hedgehog wagging his finger at you, judging you while racing.
You're too slow!
Moving on to the overall gameplay, the game is fast and smooth. Since the turning relies on you physically moving the motorbike chassis left and right to steer, the game's tracks are generally a bit wider than your average racer to compensate for the physical aspect involved. Meaning turning and tracks are pretty forgiving overall, so you never really have to worry too much about slowing down except for some tough turns in the later stages. There are a few obstacles like ramps and water, but these honestly don't have too much impact on the racing overall and are more so there just to mix things up. I think Motor Raid's real success is the combat. It's very simple and fun to use. Racking up a chain that hits while speeding past opponents is incredibly satisfying, and the game has a decent overall selection of weapons to use as well. You got hammers, staffs, scissors, and giant spike maces, but to name a few. But my favourite weapon has to be the launcher. I don't know exactly what this weapon fires out at enemies, but hitting somebody with the weapon creates a really satisfying explosion effect, which I just never get tired of. The option to also throw weapons at enemies is welcome as well. This is useful for taking out enemies ahead of you, but also for taking a gamble and trying to trade your current weapon for one of the stronger weapons your target is holding, like a launcher for example. On the sound front, the game features a great selection of original electronic tracks. I wouldn't say it holds up to the likes of the iconic Daytona USA, but the music matches the look and feel of the game perfectly, and these tracks wouldn't feel out of place in a Wipeout game from the era. Check out some of the highlights. It's also worth mentioning some of the characters' voice lines. You hear these when selecting a character or finishing a race, and they can be unintentionally abrupt and hilarious.
I won, but I still can't find what I'm looking for.
I'm no match for anyone. I'll show you who's number one. Shanahan's the king of Motor Raid. I'll strip it.
Now, despite running on the aging Model 2 hardware, which was already surpassed by Sega's newer Model 3 hardware released the previous year, I think Motor Raid looks great. The graphics are colourful and the tracks really nail that sci-fi aesthetic. The bike designs are also really well done. I mean, there's some clear influence from popular culture, but for the time the game has a look and feel all its own. It's a real shame we never see Motor Raid receive a home port to the Sega Saturn or PC like we did with other popular Model 2 racing games. This game would have been a real standout on the Saturn especially, and even with the reduced power of the system, Motor Raid would have likely been remembered as one of the best racers on the system. Despite being largely forgotten today, I think Motor Raid is a great game still worth celebrating. It's another highlight in Sega's impressive line of arcade racers, and stands out from the crowd thanks to its sci-fi aesthetic and close quarters combat. Definitely a game worth trying out if you're ever lucky enough to come across a cabinet in the wild.